So the last thing I want to bring up is, again, in this book, near the end, you circle back to China. And I didn't know a lot about China, especially was it 79 or 80? We really started propping them up or helping them turn, you say, capitalist. And two guests prior to you, I had a guy on named Michael Scheuer, who was the head of the CIA's Bin Laden unit. He was a guy who was tracking down, trying to kill Bin Laden, and he was always highly critical of the American efforts of fighting terrorism. It's like, you don't fight terrorism, you fight insurgencies. They're an army, you fight it differently. But he made a remark one time that it came to me reading this, and he said that for some reason, American decision makers, especially political decision makers, have become, in a sense, Marxist. They've become Marxist in the belief that democracy and capitalism will always win. It'll always come out in the end. And reading this history about how the Americans were really propping up the Chinese to become capitalists, forgetting that their core essence was not. It ignored property rights, it ignored individual rights. Could you talk about that briefly? Because that is just utterly fascinating, the lack of decision making.
Yeah, thank you. So it's one of my two favorite chapters in the book, the Fed chapter and the China chapter. And by the way, it's when I get feedback, it seems to be everybody else's favorite chapters as well. Because it's so stark when you really kind of look at the whole scenario and realize that we exported capitalism to them to their great benefit at the same time that we started importing, if you will, central planning to our detriment. And yes, we also imported cheap goods, which were deflationary, but the consequence of that was that we had less innovation, fewer opportunities for small business, wage suppression, and obviously a huge infringement on global intellectual property rights. And I try to relate this core thesis back to the tenets of capitalism, why it's so important. But you have to remember, and this comes up over and over, and I've got some stuff this week on my Twitter feed about China and what's going on there, is at their core, they are communists. They don't believe in individual rights or property rights. We've seen the human rights violations against the Uyghurs and a whole bunch of other people. We've seen what happened to Jack Ma when he got too big and, was pulled into obscurity or whatnot. So if you don't have a sort of central principle that believes in individual or property rights, you end up with China, where people can't take the risk to innovate because it's too risky. You're not going to own what it is that you're innovating. So they are replicators, and that is their entire culture. And that's why they not only steal intellectual property, but they don't see that there's a problem with stealing intellectual property because they don't believe in property. I mean, that's just the system that they're in. And so I think it's a really good, it's meant as a mirror reflection for us to look at not only what central planners did in terms of making the wrong decisions. We're going to have a trading partner who doesn't believe in the same rules of the game. You can't play football if the two teams are playing with two different sets of rules to the game, right? There needs to be the standard guardrails of property rights and transparency. And so that was a complete miscalculation on their standpoint, and they are to blame for the huge growth in China in a bad way. It's not that I don't want to see the Chinese people prosper. It's not that I don't want to see Chinese people lifted out of extreme poverty. Obviously we do, but we want to see that in that fair playing field that benefits everyone. I mean, why is it that they can steal our intellectual property? Why is it that if we want to do investments in their country, that we need a business partner, yet they can do whatever they can to us? And I warn, these kind of young Marxists, each of the rich people, China is printing billionaires at a faster rate than the US right now. So if you think billionaires should be illegal in the US, what about all those billionaires in China that are then going to control all the money and power? And so it's that kind of like, if you, again, don't have the economic background, you can't think like 5 steps ahead in how all of this is interconnected, is where you get these like short-term things like, oh yes, we should definitely open up trade with China and walk them into the World Trade Organization, which again ended up screwing the American people over to the benefit of the Chinese. And so that's, really kind of the part of the larger takeaway. But there's obviously a lot of deep information that lays that out within that chapter, which I think people, not only do I think people will learn a lot, I know because my husband decided to tell me about something that he learned from that chapter, but he didn't remember where he'd heard it from. So he's like, oh, I heard this really interesting thing I wanted to tell you, blah, blah, blah. And I was like, yeah, that's from my book. He's like, oh, yeah. Oh my God. So I know people are absorbing it. They may not remember where it came from, but like I know that it's fascinating. So it was fascinating to me as I knew a lot of the things individually, but this was the first time I really had pieced it together in that way. And it has my feelings about free trade have shifted over time as you realize that they're not playing by the same set of rules and the challenges that creates. So like as a free marketeer, I know a lot of free marketeers like global trade is good and we should have and yes, if everyone has the same playing field, but if they don't, then it's no longer free trade anymore. And so we need to look at it through that lens. So I think that's like one area where I have evolved in terms of my own views on things. And you can see the current level of that thinking within that chapter.
This is just for the audience again, the war on small business, how the government used the pandemic to crush the backbone of America. If you like this content and want to hear other things like it, head on over to the website at blackmarketleadership.com. That's blackmarketleadership.com. There you can subscribe to the podcast and you can even create a free members profile